Of course, a lot of defenders of Israel would like us to think that somehow the war started on October 7th, and before then, Israel was just a normal country living peacefully, and people were living peacefully. And this is, of course, not true because the war situation is constant, it is permanent. Israel is in a state of permanent war.
This was my guest today, Benjamin Beit-Hallahmi. Benny is a relentless truth seeker, unafraid to dismantle the comfortable lies that individuals and nations tell themselves. He takes a scalpel to the collective psyche of Israel, and with it he cuts through the layers of myth, fear and moral contradictions that fuel the conflict. In doing so, he reveals truth most of us would rather ignore. Welcome back to Solcube Analytics, where we challenge mainstream narratives and dive deep into global events. I'm Thomas Karat, your host, presenting weekly insights from recognized thought leaders like diplomats, academics, intelligence experts, and sometimes activists of some sort. So join us as we uncover the hidden stories beneath the headlines. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any of your other preferred podcast platforms. You know, when we talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, most of us think we have heard all of it, right? But what if I told you that beneath the surface there is a deeper layer of human behavior, a layer of survival instincts and social conditioning that we almost never consider? And that understanding of this hidden layer could completely shift how you see the entire conflict. In this conversation, I'm sitting down, as said, with Benjamin Beit-Hallahmi, a man who spent his career exploring the psychology behind Israel's national identity, the roots of Zionism, and how the collective mindset of an entire nation can be shaped and sometimes warped by historical trauma. But there's the thing, this isn't just your typical academic discussion. There are moments in this interview where you're going to hear things that may challenge your core assumptions. Ideas that touch upon who we are as humans, driven by our primal instincts to protect, to belong, and sometimes to deny. Now, as you listen, you might notice how the conversation naturally peels back layers, how certain historical events are explained in ways you have likely never considered. It's like watching a puzzle come together, but with pieces you didn't even know were missing. And trust me, there were a few moments that caught me off guard, revelations that make you sit up and rethink everything. If you have ever wondered why some conflicts seem impossible to resolve, or why groups of people cling to certain beliefs even when those beliefs come at a great cost, well, you're about to hear answers that tap into the very core of human nature. You're talking about hardwired behaviors, social loyalty, and the kind of moral dissonance that's been passed down for generations. So, and here's something specific that we dug into during our conversation. A leaked plan that allegedly outlines the forced relocation of all Palestinians from Gaza. Now, this plan, believe it or not, must have been prepared way before the events of October the 7th, because it was leaked only 6 days later, and it raises some serious ethical questions. Are we witnessing the mechanics of survival or something much more deliberate? We discussed this in the interview, and Benny pushed back on these claims. His take? That's rubbish. I've added the link to this article, which includes the original report in Hebrew, so that you can make up your own mind, in the description below. So stick with us. This is one of those conversations that will leave you with more questions than answers, and that's exactly why it's worth watching. Professor Beit-Hallahmi, what a pleasure having you. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
The pleasure and the honor is all mine. Trust me, it's all mine. You are the generous one. Okay, we agreed. You were kind enough. We go by first name, Benny.
Yeah.
I did some research, like I always do. But in your case, it was really an interesting journey, because the more research I did, the more intrigued I became. Why? Because you're connecting the psychology of war with what's actually happening in Gaza and the West Bank, in the whole Middle Eastern situation. Yeah, and me as behavior analyst, yeah, I'm especially interested in these kind of things because I believe, and that's already been my first question. I believe the only means to understand what's really going on is on a psychological or even evolutionary psychological way. So, what's your entry point into this conflict today, looking through the lens of psychology?
Well, I think that my perspective is both historical and psychological, because we first have to look at history, and within history, we see some psychological forces that are very, very important. The number one problem, you might call, is the problem of identity. People fight for identities, and people are socialized from the minute they are born. They are being told and indoctrinated about their identity, and in most cases, it's the tribal religious identity, which they learn with their mother's milk or formula or whatever they start imbibing. And so we belong to a certain group, a certain tribe. This group identity becomes part of our personal identity. And so we are very sensitive to any threat to identity. And we are very sensitive to the idea that our identity is not the best. And there was a social psychologist named Henry Tadfeld, or Teifel originally. And Henry Teifel did these experiments about the basic group. And it goes like this: you go into a classroom and you say, all the people on my right are the greens, all the people on my left are the blues. And 5 minutes later, you give them questionnaires, and the greens think that they are better than the blues, and the blues think they're better than the greens. This is it. Identity comes with superiority and with self-esteem. So this is very, very sensitive. And unfortunately, humanity is divided up into millions not today of groups and groupings, small groups and loud groups sometimes. And we all feel threatened in terms of identity. Human beings feel threatened and respond to threats aggressively and want to maintain the group. Now, to maintain group balance and equilibrium, we need to take care of internal aggressions. And very simply, everybody knows that internal aggressions are externalized. We externalize internal aggressions, and in this way, we manage to keep the group in equilibrium and balanced. Within the group, sometimes there are scapegoats that are sacrificed so the group can keep its own equilibrium. And this is something that has been known, all these things has been known for a long time. But this is the reality we live in.
Well encapsulated. I know the experiment. I thought it was a blue pen and a red pen,
Yeah.
but there's of course the more dramatic version where the researcher divided a group of students into the how do you call them the prison guards
Yeah.
and the other one as the
Yeah.
prisoners. And
Yeah.
what you saw there, I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. Yeah?
Yeah.
But before we proceed, I will introduce you a little bit more. I have here a couple of notes next to me. So, I mean, I had a closer look at your book, Original Sins, and we will discuss it later, yeah, because it's brilliant. Yeah, it explains so much. But in my notes here, I have here so Benjamin Beit-Hallahmi is a renowned scholar whose research delves into the psychological foundations of Israeli identity, Zionism, and the religious narratives that shape Israel's political landscape. He's an Israeli psychologist and academic widely known for his work on psychology and religion and Zionism. And your research explores the intersection between identity and politics, or religion and politics. And you have a very critical view on Zionism, which is exactly the reason why I've reached out to you. The book I mentioned already, I think it's from 1993, but it's a kind of a seminal work because it's really absolutely relevant today. Now, we are recording this interview here, I think 2 days after, or is it now the third day already? 2 or 3 days after these attacks so the Israeli or the Mossad or whoever did it, 3,000 electronic devices in Lebanon were just exploded. Most of them pagers, but on the second wave also I heard radios, even solar panels, walkie-talkies, and these kind of things. So that's the context here. Now, if we use this as an example, and you look through your lens and your studies and your experience, how can you? I mean, there are already discussions going on. Is this now war crime? Is it states terror because it's indiscriminate? Yeah, that I mean, nurses, doctors, taxi drivers, everybody was attacked with this. Yeah. So looking through your lens as a psychologist who has studied this, how do you explain such behavior on an individual level and then on a group level? And the group, of course, being Israel.
I really don't want to go into the details of the current war. The current war started on October 7th, 2023, as we all know, and has been going on for almost a year. And every day people die. Every day somebody is getting killed. And basically, war is legalized murder. And you have Group 1 killing members of Group 2, and identity, like I said, is the most important factor. For Israel, this is a war for its mere existence, because the threat uh, displayed on October 7th has been unprecedented. This has been an unprecedented attack, an unprecedented defeat for the military. And so every day since October 7th, 2023, Israel is trying to set a new record. In other words, correct the impression of this terrible mismanagement of October 7th, this terrible disaster, which showed the Israeli military to be disorganized and efficient. And now the Israeli leadership is trying to show the world that the Israeli military can do a lot more, can take revenge, and can regain deterrence. The important thing is deterrence. And obviously, on October 7th, Israel lost a lot of its deterrence capability. And so the goal is to regain it by any means necessary, which means a lot of casualties on the other side, but a lot of casualties on the Israeli side, which is inevitable. When you go into war, it means that a lot of people are going to get killed, and you need people who are going to go into battle ready to fight and ready to lose their lives. And this is what war has been about for, you know, tens of thousands of years. Human beings have done that. So to me, the important thing that we should do if we want to understand what is going on today, is going back 150 years ago to look at the beginnings of Zionism, the beginnings of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. This is the important thing. Look back and see how things developed, and how some human beings, a small group of human beings, had a vision about the Jewish state in Palestine, and how this vision became a reality. And it seemed initially an impossibility. It was an impossible dream. It was inconceivable that Jewish sovereignty could be established in Palestine. But the vision developed into a political program. And this political program has been successful. However, there have been strategic threats from the other side, and I would tie October 7th, 2023, to December 1987, the first Intifada. The first Intifada was also a major disaster for Israel, an earth-shaking event, because for the first time, the Palestinians who had been dispossessed by the Zionist enterprise became a strategic threat. Not just a problem, not just a nuisance, but a strategic threat that demanded a major mobilization and a major effort. So this is what we saw in 1987. This is what we see today. Okay? But I think it's worthwhile to go back into history and understand the vision that, from the point of view of Zionism, was a vision of liberation. Take the Jewish people in the diaspora, a people that was regarded as inferior, as weak, as incapable of fighting, and make it into a liberated group, a free group of human beings who can cope, who can fight, who can settle. And so the Zionist enterprise in Palestine was at the same time both a liberation effort for Jews, but a colonization effort for non-Jews and a dispossession for non-Jews. And it didn't really matter to Zionism who was living in Palestine. It didn't matter the least. But Zionism wanted the land, not the indigenous population. This was clear from day one. But the history of Zionism is very interesting because it started, and here I'm quoting a book by a major Zionist writer named Nahum Sokolov, who was born in Eastern Europe and became really a brilliant Zionist diplomat and writer. And he authored a book on the history of Zionism, and he titled it The History of Zionism 1600 until 1918. So according to Sokolov, Zionism started in 1600. And the question is, who were the Zionists in 1600? And it turned out that starting with 1600 and going on until the end of the 19th century, the Zionists were only non-Jews. Zionism was not a Jewish idea. It was an idea that was developed and proposed by Christians. There were Christians of all kinds who proposed creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And they had some kind of religious vision. Okay, so this is very, very interesting. It started as a religious vision coming from non-Jews, Christians, who were dreaming about the second coming. And as part of the second coming, they envisioned the Jewish restoration in Palestine. This was a necessary part to them of the second coming. And that's why they became Zionists. So this is very, very interesting.
I will go into your book,
Yeah.
Original Saints. It's a brilliant title, by the way. Yeah? And there is a chapter about Zionism as a colonial project. Yeah, and
Yes.
you already kind of introduced that topic. But before we do, I want to make something clear. Before you said, and rightly so, the current war started as October the 7th. Now, I learned from experience we have to be very specific. You are not saying that the whole problem started October the 7th, like many other people do. I know
No,
from your writings that you are completely, you go at the very sources at the very beginning. So the current war started October the 7th. Not the whole problem started at October 7th.
of course, a lot of defenders of Israel would like us to think that somehow the war started on October 7th. And before then, Israel was just a normal country living peacefully, and people were living peacefully. And this is, of course, not true because the war situation is constant, it is permanent. Israel is in a state of permanent war. And there are, of course, some times where the war is not as violent and as powerful as it is right now, where lots of people are dying. There are times where only a few people are dying, but still, this is a war, and whoever lives in Israel realizes that Israel is always in a state of war. Always.
I think I think not only the people living in Israel, especially the people who are not living in Israel, the
Yeah.
people who live in Palestine, they realize
Yeah.
it's a constant war.
Yes. Yes. Of course. Of course. Yeah. So this is because if you try to establish a state which is a settler colonialist state, you are going to encounter resistance. And this was something that the early Zionists were quite conscious of. The earliest Zionists knew very well that they were going to encounter a, an indigenous population, and this population would resist their efforts to establish this settler colonialist project. As a matter of fact, uh, during the early years of Zionist settlement, and here I'm talking about the end of the 19th century, the real Zionist settlement started in 1882, and already then the Zionist settlers were wondering about why the natives were not displaying a stronger resistance. This was the question. Why is it that the indigenous population seemed to be passive? And this was something that was being discussed openly and privately in writings. And the various writers at the time that we can read were discussing the situation on the ground. And I will give you one example. And this is a man who is very famous in Israel today and not so famous outside of Israel. But in every Israeli city, you have a street named after Ben Yehuda. Eliezer Ben Yehuda was this author and scholar who is sometimes credited with reviving the Hebrew language. One of the great achievements of the Zionist movements was the reviving of the Hebrew language, making the Hebrew language, which was always a written language and a language that people read every day, making it into an everyday language, having people speak Hebrew 24 hours a day. So Ben Yehuda was very active in reviving the language in the sense that he created new words. He came to Palestine in 1881 already. And in 1882, we have letters written by Ben Yehuda. And there he proposed a way of taking over the country without raising any resistance on the part of the indigenous population. How do you do that? Ben Yehuda proposed a secret organization that would buy up the land. So this secret organization would buy up the land, and then when the indigenous people would realize that the land had been bought from under them, it would be too late. So this was his scheme, which of course no one took seriously, because it wasn't really a practical idea. Land was being bought openly, and this was being discussed everywhere by Zionists. And in 1991, there was another famous Zionist writer who used the pen name Ahad Ha'am, which means in Hebrew, one of the people. His real name was Asher Ginsberg, and he was a very important activist and writer. And so Ahad Ha'am in 1991 came to Palestine for 3 months to visit the Zionist settlements. So there were already enough Zionist settlements, about 20 of them or 25 settlements by 1991. And Ahad Ha'am spent 3 months in Palestine and wrote articles about the reality of the settlement in Palestine. And the articles were titled The Truth from Palestine. And they are very, very well known. And what he said that the natives of Palestine, the indigenous population, is well aware of our intentions. That's how he phrased it. The Arabs know very well what we have in mind for Palestine. However, he wrote, when they wake up and present a significant resistance, it is going to be too late because we are going to be too numerous and too strong. And we are going to have many more settlements, and we are going to own more of the land. So this was his perspective. In 1991 already, he said that native resistance.
In 1891. You said 19.
1891 already, he said that native resistance was going to be ineffective. We are going to be stronger than them. We're going to defeat them. Even though he regarded them, the indigenous population, as a group of people who are very intelligent and also very productive. He was very impressed with the indigenous agriculture. He said they were very good in terms of working the land, whereas the Jewish Zionist settlements were a joke, the way he looked at them. They were not, Jews were still not very good as farmers. They were no competition to the natives, he said, in terms of agriculture, but this will take time, and he believed that the settlements would develop and resistance would be ineffective and futile. I want to emphasize that in 1891, where Ahad Ha'am was spending 3 months in Palestine and visiting the settlements, Theodor Herzl, who is considered by many people mistakenly to be the founder of Zionism, had no idea what was going on in Palestine and wasn't interested. Maybe he read about it, but he had no interest in Zionism. As a matter of fact, in 1891, Herzl was sent by his newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse of Vienna, to Paris and became a top expert on French politics. As a matter of fact, he published a book titled Palais Bourbon in 1895, the same year that he published The Jewish State. So by 1891, Herzl was completely ignorant of the Zionist movement, but there was already a real Zionist movement. However, Herzl made a real contribution to Zionism, and this was the idea of having an alliance with imperial powers. What Herzl proposed was that to be successful in creating a Jewish state. And at first, by the way, Herzl didn't care if it was in Palestine or somewhere else. Initially, when Herzl was writing about the Jewish state, he was interested in any territory outside Europe.
Argentina. Yeah, even Argentina. Yeah.
Argentina or Africa or anywhere, take the Jews outside of Europe and settle them somewhere. It was only later when Herzl realized that the Zionist movement that was alive already and the Jewish masses in Eastern Europe would not listen to ideas about settlements in Argentina or Africa, but were more excited about settling in Palestine. However, this did not mean that the Jewish masses in Eastern Europe were rushing to settle in Palestine. Not at all. In 1881, the Jewish masses in Eastern Europe, and especially in the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire at the time, started moving out and migrating out of Europe. But where did they want to go? They wanted to go to the New World. They wanted to go to New York City. And millions of Jews ended up going to the United States and settling in the United States, and very few came to Palestine. Very, very few. The Zionist leaders in Eastern Europe were trying to tell people that going to Palestine is more important and would give them a better future. But they refused to listen. They thought the United States would be a better place to create a future for themselves and their children.
That explains also why we have such a, till today, why we have such a strong influence of the Jewish lobby on American politics, especially foreign politics.
Yeah, because by the 1920s already, there was a very large Jewish community in the United States. And of course, even before the 1920s, Jewish organizations in the United States, starting in the 19th century already, were working politically to help other Jews outside of the United States. There was this international orientation and this feeling of responsibility for Jews everywhere. And Jewish organizations and Zionist organizations were working internationally, first following Herzl's idea, of course, of creating an alliance with imperial powers. And of course, we know that the mother country was Great Britain. Great Britain became the mother country for the Zionist project in Palestine. However, I'm sure that very few people today realize that the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917, given by the British government, was approved beforehand by the US President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson read the text of the Balfour Declaration before it was ever published. So the
76 words that changed history.
yes, yes, yes. And the United States supported the Balfour Declaration. And more than that, the United States was determined to make the settler colonial project in Palestine possible. Why am I emphasizing this point? Because Woodrow Wilson was the man who gave the famous speech about the 14 principles that would shape the world. And one of the principles was self-determination. Now, the United States government and people in the US government, and we know that because they wrote about this, were aware that in Palestine they are determined to ignore the idea of self-determination. It was actually the United States Secretary of State at the time who asked, does the principle of self-determination apply to Palestine? And it was obvious that it was not going to be applied to Palestine. Balfour himself actually was aware of this and wrote about this. There was a famous memo that Balfour wrote to the British cabinet in 1919, in which he said, we are ignoring the wishes of the majority population in Palestine. It was very clear. And he said, nevertheless, Zionism is what the big power want. He said the big powers, which at the time were Britain, France, the United States mainly, the big powers are committed to Zionism. And that is why we are going to ignore the wishes of the majority population. Now, the United States, to its credit, we must say, the United States government sent a fact-finding mission to Palestine in 1918, and this was the King Crane Commission, named after the two gentlemen who went to Palestine and spent time there and interviewed many, many people. And they wrote a report that was kept secret for a few years, but then became public. And this report stated that the majority population in Palestine was opposed, totally opposed to the Zionist project and wanted self-determination. Moreover, the report also stated, after interviewing British officers, that making the Zionist project in Palestine a reality would require a large military force. So already then we are talking about this permanent war situation. The British officers spoke about 50,000 soldiers, which then was a fantastic number. And we know that today, a lot more than 50,000 soldiers are involved. But from day one, if we look at these documents, at the King Crane report, and the correspondence with Balfour and Zionist leaders, we know that the Zionist project was being imposed by force on the indigenous population. There was no doubt about it. So this is the reality when the British Mandate was started in 1922. And once the British Mandate was in place, the triumph of Zionism was not far behind.
The British man, I mean, we could go on and on like this through the details of the creation of history. There are a couple of things. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, there's hardly any dispute here that from the very beginning on, it was clear what the Zionist project was after. Yeah, and both the choice of the country, but also more importantly, you mentioned it, the choice of the language was strategic. So there were different languages. Yeah, some argued at the time for German or Yiddish, but there was a strategic decision to take, to unite the Jews under the umbrella of the biblical homeland. Yeah, so there are really connections, but again, these choices were made strategic. Now, coming back, so I think we captured the essence that the Zionist project in the essence is a colonial project. Okay, I believe that's also one, or maybe in the first chapter of the book. The second one is then what you call the original sin, which is directly correlated to the first. So the original sin as displacement haunts Israeli society, creating a legacy of guilt, denial, and psychological repression that continues to influence Israeli politics and identity. That's a quote.
Yes.
So going from the colonial project to the original sin. Please elaborate.
Well, I actually, in my book, I spoke about two original sins. One original sin is anti-Semitism. In other words, the Jews were subject to anti-Semitism wherever they lived, and anti-Semitism is still a reality today. There's no question about it that we can encounter anti-Semitism everywhere. And one of my favorite examples is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the president of the United States in 1972, and he had a so-called spiritual advisor. His spiritual advisor was a famous preacher, Billy Graham. Billy Graham was world famous as a preacher. He appeared on television, he appeared at large rallies all over the world, all over Europe, and he met privately with Richard Nixon. And thanks to Richard Nixon, who wanted everything in the White House recorded at the time, we have a recording and we know exactly what Richard Nixon and Billy Graham were talking about. And what they were talking about, among other things, was the Jews and how the Jews were evil and how the Jews in the United States were controlling the media and acting politically against Richard Nixon, despite the fact that he had Jewish individuals working with him, quite close to him. But he didn't mean these people, he meant so-called left-wing or progressive Jews that are conspiring against him. But both Billy Graham and Richard Nixon agree that Israelis are not like Jews. Okay? They are fine. The Israelis are fine. The problem is with the Jews who are scheming and conspiring against Richard Nixon. Now, on top of that, we have a recording of Billy Graham sympathizing with Hitler, no less. We have a recording that shows that Billy Graham says that in Germany, the situation was just like in the United States. In other words, the Jews in Germany were controlling everything, the media and the banks and politics, etc. And so it's understandable that Hitler acted against them. But he went about it the wrong way. This is the only reservation that Billy Graham had about Hitler. But in principle, he agreed with Hitler that Jews had too much power. So this is just one example of anti-Semitism, which is being expressed in many, many ways, in many, many places. So this is the reality that we have this prejudice together with many other prejudices.
Before we leave that, I would like to interject. Yeah, Noam Chomsky told me that the very existence of the state of Israel is the epitome of anti-Semitism, and he meant exactly what you just described. Yeah, the various countries were looking for a place for Jews so that they didn't have to take them. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And this is, of course, expressed in history, for example, in Tsarist Russia. In 1825, there was this group of the Decabalists who were conspiring against the Tsar and wanted a revolution already. But these Decabalists, these revolutionaries, part of their plan was getting rid of the Jews and kicking the Jews out and maybe sending them to Palestine. Exactly, exactly. That Jews should be sent away as far as possible. So we have this reality of anti-Semitism, And we had,
So anti-Semitism was the first sin that you mentioned, yeah? And
yes,
now
yes.
the second sin,
The
the
second
original
thing
sin,
is in trying to solve the first problem and make life better for Jews, the creation of Israel, the creation of a settler colonialist state at the expense of the indigenous population. The Zionist project meant that the indigenous people were becoming refugees, and this was the plan. The idea, like I mentioned in 1882, with Ben Yehuda wanting the land but not the people. The people would have to go somewhere. It doesn't matter. And the question of where the indigenous people would go was being discussed openly in the 1920s and the 1930s. The indigenous people, because these things were being discussed so openly, realized what was being planned for them and were trying to resist. However, like I said, the British mandate was on the side of the Zionist project, very obviously. There was a major rebellion in Palestine that started in 1936, but this rebellion ended in the defeat, decisive defeat of the Palestinians. And this is a very important chapter in the history of the Palestinians, because 10 years later, when the state of Israel was officially declared, they were in really bad shape in terms of being able to resist, and were easily defeated and expelled and made into a nation of refugees. So the plan was there in 1882 already. And gradually, Palestinians were being dispossessed. And there were many, many cases that were being discussed openly by Zionists of Palestinian sharecroppers. This was the very well-known problem, the problem of the sharecroppers, because Zionists purchased the land from absentee landlords. There were these rich absentee landlords who were living maybe in Beirut, and they sold a piece of land, but this piece of land had sharecroppers living on it. So the first job of the Zionist settlers was drive out the sharecroppers. And this was really a tragic situation that some Zionists were well aware of, and describing it in their writings, how these poor people, these helpless people that didn't have anything, were being pushed off their land, being pushed out of their homes, the only place they knew where they lived and their ancestors had lived, and they were being pushed away, and nobody cared about what happened to them. And so this is part of the reality of settlement.
but if you describe all of this, so how does it haunt the Israeli society, and how does it express itself psychologically, or even in the policies or the politics that we are seeing today? This kind of, yeah.
Well, again, I can go back to history and present two views. The so-called Zionist left claimed that there was no problem. And you could find Zionist Marxists, no less, who argued that the Zionist movement was a liberation movement for the indigenous people as well, because Zionism was liberating the poor sharecroppers from the landowners, from the rulers, from the local leaders who were all corrupt. This was true, and they were all corrupt. But it's hard to see how, by becoming refugees, these people, by becoming homeless, these people were being liberated. But this was the official line of the so-called Zionist left, denying the conflict. In other words, there's no conflict between Zionism and the indigenous population. And then, at the same time, the so-called right-wing Zionists, such as Jabotinsky, who was a very important leader and intellectual and writer, Jabotinsky in 1923 wrote this famous article titled The Iron Wall. The Iron Wall describes Zionism as colonialism, as militarized colonialism, armed colonialism. We are coming to this country to change it from an Arab country to a Jewish country. This is it. And you cannot expect the indigenous population not to resist. They will resist as long as they can. And he spoke specifically about the Palestinians because he said, you are trying to make a deal with those living in Baghdad or Mecca. He referred specifically to those. So you talk to the people of Baghdad or Mecca, but you are not talking to the Palestinians. This is their homeland. They don't care about Baghdad or Mecca. They care about this piece of land, this small piece of land, which is their homeland. And he compared them, and this may come as a shock, to the indigenous population of the New World being conquered by the Spaniards. Okay, and he specifically talks about the Aztecs in Mexico. Okay, and he says, we are the conquistadors and they are the Aztecs. So this is a complete openness about colonialism. He says we are the colonizers. And uh, this idea that Jabotinsky expressed so openly was rejected officially by the left, of course, but in practice, the Iron Wall described a strategy which is the Israeli strategy until today. In other words, we have to create a superior military force. We have to create an ability, a military ability that is going to be so powerful that deterrence is going to be clear. Our ability to deter any resistance should be clear. And that is why Israel today has nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and Israel has ignored all international treaties about the proliferation of nuclear weapons or about the prohibition of chemical weapons or the prohibition of biological weapons or the prohibition of landmines. Israel has simply ignored all these treaties. And it's very interesting that the world, and I mean the world, has come together to sign the well-known treaty with Iran that everybody knows about. The treaty with Iran, signed by China, Russia, the European Union, Britain, and the United States, and on the one side, and Iran on the other. In other words, all the world powers signed an agreement with Iran that is designed to limit the development of nuclear weapons by Iran. In other words, it preserves the nuclear monopoly and the biological monopoly and the chemical monopoly in terms of weapons of mass destruction held by Israel. In other words, everybody, including China and Russia, is committed to the idea that Israel should have the monopoly on these weapons. No one ever mentions Israeli nuclear weapons. The emphasis is on the Iranians and what they are going to do. And the world has accepted the idea that Israel should have nuclear weapons, and no one talks about this.
It goes a step further. The US actually assisted Israel in developing their nuclear weapons, and I can be more specific. Israel stole nuclear secrets, and I have an interview with James Bamford. He's an American investigative journalist about Arnon Milchan. He's a Hollywood billionaire, and
Yeah.
he confessed on I don't know if you know him. Yeah, he confessed on a Israeli television station in Hebrew that he was a spy for Israel for at least 20, 30 years, if not longer. He even indicated other Hollywood celebrities doing the same for him. Now, through documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, we know that the FBI found this out. Yeah, specifically, the one specific case was for specialized nuclear triggers, also highly, highly sophisticated devices that were smuggled out. And the interesting part here is that successive American governments were aware, they were made aware by the FBI. There's a whole string of disgruntled FBI officers who testified, right? So
But let me tell you that whatever the United States involvement in this, there was a much greater involvement by South Africa. And I
this is how it started. Exactly. It
and
started in
I,
South Africa.
I've written about it, and
You
I
have written about it?
yes,
You
yes,
have?
in the
I will read this. I will read
yeah,
it.
in a book titled The Israeli Connection, I described the extent of nuclear collaboration between Israel and South Africa. And it is number one, to give you just one example, Israel uh, started operating a nuclear reactor in Dimona in 1962. Now, the uranium for this reactor in 1962 already came from South Africa.
Yeah.
Now, to have a uranium delivered to you in 1962 from South Africa means that you started working on this years earlier. It's not that you get up in the morning in 1962 and you know and make a phone call to South Africa. Please send me 3 tons of uranium. It's not like that. Israel was working and collaborating with South Africa in the 1950s in order to make this possible when the reactor was being built in Dimona. And there was a very close cooperation between South Africa and Israel for many, many years. And I've documented all of this in my book, The Israeli Connection. And this is,
Nelson Mandela never forgave
yes, of
Israel.
course,
Yeah.
not just that, but now you have all sorts of defenders of Israel claiming that the alliance between Israel and South Africa started after 1973 because Israel felt so isolated. But this is a joke because, as I said, the collaboration of South Africa started in the 1950s and was quite extensive, and I could come up with many, many examples. For example, the famous Ariel Sharon, General Sharon,
Infamous.
infamous or famous, visited the South African forces in Angola. There was a South African invasion of Angola, and Sharon went there personally to visit the South African forces and was quite impressed. And he was under the impression, first of all, he said something like, they reminded him of Israeli soldiers. They were so fantastic. And he expected them, when he was looking at them, he expected them at any minute to start speaking Hebrew because they looked exactly like his soldiers in the Israeli military. But more importantly, Israel was convinced, and Israeli intelligence agencies were convinced that South Africa, uh, and I mean the apartheid regime in South Africa, would survive forever. This is what they were building on, okay? Because that's why there was so much collaboration. Because if you think that the regime is going to collapse, you're not going to put so much effort into building this alliance, and you're not going to rely on this regime as a source of uranium or other things. But the fact is that the Mossad was convinced that South Africa was going to survive very easily. And I will mention another intelligence failure. And now we are going back to the 50s and 60s. In 1960, there was a delegation of Israeli officers headed by General Yitzhak Rabin, later Prime Minister, of course, and Chaim Herzog, later the President of Israel. And these two generals headed a delegation of officers that went to Algeria to learn from the success of the French military. Okay. And they came back to Israel very, very impressed. And again, the Mossad and the Israeli military intelligence were convinced that Algeria was going to remain French, as the slogan then was in Paris, Algérie française. That's what people were shouting. Some people were shouting in France. And this was another intelligence failure. And this shows how Israel was so committed to a colonialist worldview that pushes you towards these kinds of judgments. And so in the case of South Africa and Algeria, we can see a major failure in judgment and intelligence. And there were other intelligence failures, as we know very well.
You said, I mean, Israel, there's a whole list, and I tried to find it, yeah? There's a whole list of rogue states that Israel has supported throughout its history. I analyzed, as a linguist, yeah, I analyzed the interview that Netanyahu gave with Lex Freeman, yeah, where Netanyahu said Israel is doing, is a benefit for the whole world, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's a whole list of 20, 30 countries, dictatorships that Israel supported with weapons, know-how to suppress their own population. So South Africa is only one example.
Yes.
The difference between South Africa and Israel today is because, there's this apartheid comparison, yeah, hanging over Israel. Is Israel an apartheid state, yeah? But in South Africa, the white ones, they were never intent of killing or expelling, they were intent on exploitation.
Yes.
And that's the big difference in Israel today, because they definitely want to get rid of the Arabs.
Yes. And you asked about how Israelis live with this legacy of dispossession.
Yeah.
And so today, of course, I think after the events of the last year, most Israelis will tell you that we should have done more in terms of dispossession, in terms of killing, in terms of everything. In other words, these Palestinians don't deserve all the generosity that we've shown them. Whatever we've done was still too good for these people. And you know that in Israel, the expression has been used that these are human animals. The Hamas fighters are human animals,
Yeah.
etc., etc., as people were shocked by the atrocities committed on October 7th, of course. And so today, the events of October 7th have helped Israelis in thinking that Zionism was always correct in its approach, and that these indigenous people don't deserve better, they deserve much worse. So that now when you're talking about it, this is a completely different world. Israel of the last year is different, but in earlier times, of course, there were many expressions. For example, one of actually the greatest writer in Israel, the greatest writer in the Hebrew language, who was born in 1916 in one of the first settlements, wrote about this, wrote repeatedly about the injustice of dispossession. And this is already, he was an officer in the 1948 war. And immediately after the war, he wrote his best known work, Khir Betchiza, which is the description of how a Palestinian village is being destroyed and the people are being dispossessed. And he wrote in this famous work, he described a Palestinian woman and her child being expelled from the village, and how this woman is trying to control her feelings. She's not crying, okay? She's showing a brave face, okay, as she's leaving the village with her young son. But, he says, he writes, this woman is going to turn into a lioness, and her son is going to turn into a viper, a snake, and they will come back. Okay? So you might say that this prophecy in 1949, it came true on October 7th, okay, where the lioness and the vipers came back. So he made this incredible prophecy. And then many years later, he published a book about his childhood. And in this book, he spoke to his parents, and he accused his parents of leaving him, or giving birth to him in this place where his fate was to fight forever. Okay, this accursed place. And he described this very dramatically. And he was at that point very, very critical of Zionism. However, the interesting thing is that he was considered, and is considered the greatest writer. So whatever he said, whatever his criticism, no one could criticize him. Okay, he had a privileged position to criticize Zionism and to present this very, very negative picture. And if I'm talking about prophecies and Gaza and October 7th, let me go back to Moshe Dayan, another famous general. Moshe Dayan was not only a famous general, he was very talented. He could have been a great writer in his own right. And he, in 1956, he wrote a famous eulogy. And the story is very well known in Israel. This was one of the kibbutzim on the Gaza border in 1956, the spring of 1956, where one of the men of the kibbutz was shot dead by Palestinians from Gaza. Okay, so Dayan came to give the eulogy at the funeral. And this text is very well known and is quoted. And he says, who are we to blame the murderers? They sit there in Gaza, in the refugee camps, and they see us on the land that had been their land and the land of their ancestors for countless generations. Okay, so you may be mistaken to think that Dayan is speaking with empathy. In other words, that he really understands the Palestinian suffering. No, he is saying this in the eulogy, not with any kind of empathy, but with a triumphalism. In other words, we are the winners. You are the losers, and you are going to stay there in the refugee camps. And he is speaking on the Gaza border in one of the kibbutzim that was attacked on October 7th. Okay, it's very interesting. So, because Dayan in 1956 was convinced that the Palestinians would be defeated forever, they were finished, you didn't have to worry about them, they were going to be in the refugee camps and they're going to stay there. And later on, there's another interesting quotation from Dayan in 1969, where he says every settlement in Israel used to be a Palestinian village or town. And he talks about his own village. He grew up in a village, and he says that my own village of Nahalal used to be the Palestinian village of Makhlul. In other words, every place in Israel used to be a Palestinian settlement. This is what he says. He's open about it, again, with no empathy, no regret, no contrition, no apology. He's proud of that. In other words, we are the settlers, and we have kicked out the indigenous population, and this was our job. And so this is very, very interesting in terms of regarding the history.
You also write about Zionism and Israeli identity, yeah, and you're describing this contradiction in self-perception, right? On the one side, being the victim; on the other side, just as you described, being the victor.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm not even sure you can make a separation between civil society and the army, right? So I think, who said it to me? Israel is not a state with an army, but the army with a state, right? So
Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
is militarized except the ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah.
So how is this on a psychological level? Yeah, this contradiction. I mean, we call it cognitive dissonance. Yeah, you have two opposing concepts in your mind, and you still live happily. So
Yeah,
what's your vision?
but I think again, I think the recent event of October 7th and the war since then have really affected the self-perception of most Israelis, and they see themselves more as victims and more as being under threat than being triumphant. Because remember that the settlements along the Gaza border, which were attacked on October 7th, are still empty. And in many places, you still have these burned out homes, and the people have not come back. They are also refugees now. In other words, in Israel today, there are more than 100,000 refugees.
Yeah, 60,000 from the border
Yeah,
with Lebanon. Yeah.
yeah. So this is unprecedented. The feeling of defeat and the idea that the IDF could be overcome so easily by these Palestinians that no one took seriously is such a shock that it has really affected any any discussion of the Palestinians today is affected by this. And before October 7th, you may know that on Israeli television, I myself watched the Hamas military exercises before October 7th. They showed the military exercise. They reported today, there was another military exercise, and they were preparing for the invasion of Israel with rockets and this and that. And it was presented as a joke because everybody thought that they couldn't do anything like this. They could, exercise, make noises. but it wasn't a real possibility or real threat. And
But
this,
is that the projection? Is that what the communication was, or was that really the belief of the leaders? Now we know that Egypt at least warned Israel twice. We see that the reaction from the Israel army. I mean, Israel is a very small country. Now, to my knowledge, the defense was breached on 29 places. On some of those places, it took 48 hours for the army to come there. Yeah. So where I want to go with this is, from my perspective, October the 7th is a God-sent gift for Netanyahu for a host of reasons, right? So there are a number of real question marks when it comes to October the 7th.
no, no, no. I think that that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and I don't think that Netanyahu or anybody wanted something like this. I think that, in Israel, there are all sorts of crazy people who are trying to say that there was some kind of a betrayal, but this is a joke. It's not true. And what happened in reality was that the military considered the possibility that Hamas would invade in such a way remote. Okay, and that's why when there were these exercises, nobody took them seriously.
I have a document in front of me. I discussed this in other interviews. Yeah. Let me read it here. The Israeli culture magazine Mekomit, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, yeah, published on October 28th a leaked document issued by Israel's Ministry of Intelligence, and that document is from October the 13th, so less than a week after October 7th, recommending the occupation of Gaza and the total transfer of its 2.3 million inhabitants. Yeah, there are even countries questions. Again, that's a leaked document coming from Israel's Ministry of Intelligence. Right now, this is a plan that pre-existed. This is not a plan that on October the 8th. So
No,
again,
again, no, no, I don't. I don't. First of all, there is no Ministry of Intelligence. There's no such thing. And there's military intelligence. There's Mossad. You know, in a, I don't believe that there was a plan prepared in advance. I don't think so. I don't think that anybody had a plan and waited for a chance to invade Gaza and expel the population. Not at all. I don't
I
believe it.
have I have the document in front of me. It's in Hebrew with a translation. I can send it to you.
No, no. But again, listen. I can tell you that there are people in Israel, even members of the Knesset, who uh, claim that there was a conspiracy of the left, okay, and that they had advanced knowledge of the attack and they collaborated with Hamas. I think that's ridiculous. I don't believe any conspiracy theories. You're going to tell me I've heard many conspiracy theories, and I refuse to listen to this nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, and it's ridiculous. I think that it's like with people claiming that 9/11 in New York City was an inside job and George W. Bush did it, and then JFK was assassinated by the CIA, etc., etc. And I think all these things are ridiculous, and we shouldn't even waste our time discussing them. And it's like blaming. There are lots of stories about how the Mossad is behind this, behind that. This is
Well, it's not so that Mossad is innocent. Yeah, Mossad is behind a lot of things.
that's right, but you don't know. That's the thing. That
Most things we do not know, but the pager attack from 2 days ago we do know.
Okay, we know that because it happened and there is evidence. But I refuse to believe to all these ridiculous stories like the COVID the COVID pandemic was Bill Gates and et cetera, and vaccinations are again Bill
Mm,
Gates trying to put some electronic chips into you, et cetera, et cetera.
mm.
This is nonsense. And I think that we should be very careful and we shouldn't waste our time on this kind of nonsense.
If we come back to this contradictory self perception, yeah,
Yes.
of Israel and what we see today in Gaza, but it's not only today because you mentioned Sharon, yeah, Sabra and Shatila. I mean, from a psychological perspective, yeah, and again coming back to your work, yeah, how do you live? How do you live with such a thing as a nation and as an individual? Huh?
Yeah, but I think that this happens all the time because human groups experience ups and downs, and you can be a victim at one moment, and then you can recover the next day. Okay, so this happens, and of course, the Jewish history is has a lot of tragedies in it, and in Israel, there is an attempt to overcome all these tragedies and create a new reality. So again, after October 11th, it is no wonder that people feel like victims. And this is, again, a challenge. What happened, just like I go back to the first Intifada, this is the first time that Palestinians have become a threat, a strategic threat. And Israel is still working to remove this threat. And all the efforts in Gaza or in Lebanon are still to remove the threat and to regain deterrence. So I think that a lot of people are still going to die because of this idea that Israel has to recover this deterrence ability. And
Yeah, I'm afraid you may be right. So
yeah,
there is no end very soon,
yeah,
and many victims on many sides. But
yeah,
question I'm wondering, yeah, is it? I mean, I know the argument is very often made, yeah, Israel is under this perpetual victimhood and needs security. On the other hand, Israel, when it had the chance, never exchanged land for peace. It was never interested in giving land for peace. So in as much is that an argument that basically serves the wider purpose, which is clearly under the Netanyahu government, the greater Israel from the river to the sea, which by the way is an Israeli slogan. Yeah, it's a slogan in the Likud charter. It has nothing to do, it doesn't come from the Palestinians. Nevertheless, it's illegal in certain countries now.
yeah. This is another issue that right now you have people who dream about greater Israel and they are in government, but in reality, I think that most Israelis are not for greater Israel right now. And most Israelis are very, very worried about their future, and they are ready to settle for much less than greater Israel because, again, of recent events, which were a real shock to the
Mm.
system.
Yeah. I interviewed a week ago. I interviewed Dan Perry, who was for many years Associated Press head
Yeah, yeah,
for.
I know who is. Yeah,
Okay, and he said something that actually was new to me, but he also put a caveat on it. He said it's not likely. So he was talking about the partition of Israel, but not between Israelis and Palestinians, but between those Israelis that he calls bonehead, who populate the West Bank, yeah, and those other Israelis, most of which are in the coastal areas, which do not want war, yeah. So is that a thought that you're familiar with?
yeah, yeah. This has been, there's been a talk about that for a long, long time
Really? I never
because,
heard about this.
yeah, because of the settlers and
Yeah.
no, this is, yeah, but
I mean, we know it's not realistic. We know that, yeah.
yeah,
But I was not aware that this thought in itself exists within Israel. I didn't know.
yeah, yeah, because you have the religious Zionists who've become very, very important and very influential, but they are a minority. Okay, they're a very important minority, but they're still a minority. So, of course, a lot of people have real reservations about them. Yeah,
Benny, on that note, you were very generous with your time.
yeah,
I really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface, especially also in regards to your book. You mentioned just the second book. I will have a
yeah. The
look at it.
second book has to do with South Africa and Nicaragua and Central America and Honduras and Argentina and Pinochet. And, this is all covered in my book, The Israeli Connection.
Yeah. Maybe one last thing, because you at the very beginning you mentioned it, the indoctrination of Israelis. Yeah. Now I don't know if you know her, but I interviewed Nurit Peled El-Hanan.
Yeah.
She does research in
Yes,
regards to
I know, I
racism
know, I know, I
in
know.
Israeli school books. So what's your vision on the indoctrination?
But
I have
this
said
is
it,
no, this is I spoke about indoctrination everywhere. It doesn't matter where
it's
you
true.
are.
It's true.
People indoctrinate their children because they want their children to believe in what they believe in. So I work on this, especially in terms of religion, but it's true also in terms of nationality. And we know that people inherit from their parents, and this is interesting, not only religion, but also supporting a certain sports team, right? If your parents support a certain sports team, you will too. Okay, and we know about various sports teams in Europe and how the fans are so violent and so crazy, and they inherit this from their parents. Okay, and also political parties. Okay, your father voted for a certain party, you will vote for the same party. So it's the same everywhere. There's nothing unique about Israel. But Israel, because you have a state of war, so indoctrination is very, very serious. We are not talking about a football game. We are talking about life and death. And going back to Dayan, in this famous eulogy said that this is our fate. We have to, the job of being a settler means that you work on the land, but you hold your arms, okay? You hold your gun and you hold, you drive a tractor, okay? So this is the tradition because you have to fight, you have to be ready to fight because the land, like Diane said, had been taken from somebody else. So you have to fight for it. But Diane was optimistic and he thought that this fighting would last only for one generation. And it's become permanent and it seems to be going on forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another coincidence, and then we conclude this interview. Moshe Dayan, I just remembered the journalist who interviewed Milchan sitting next to Robert De Niro for I don't know what the program's name was. Yeah, is actually the daughter, granddaughter, or niece from Moshe Dayan.
No. Her name is Diane. I know. You're talking about Ilana Dayan.
Okay.
And she is a relative, but not very close.
Okay. Okay.
And actually, Diane's children, uh, he had three children, and two of them was totally opposed to him politically. So it doesn't mean anything. People, in Israel sometimes don't follow their parents, especially somebody like Dayan, who wasn't really an ideal father. I don't know if you know the story, but he wasn't really a good father. He neglected his children, so he didn't have a chance to indoctrinate them. And his son was a brilliant, brilliant movie maker. He made some movies that were really fantastic about Israel and very, very critical of the dominant political ideas, and he was a writer, brilliant writer. I really liked his stories, So
Is he still alive?
no, he died a few years ago, and he was also a drug addict and all sorts of crazy stuff. But he was brilliant. I just loved everything that he did, everything he wrote. He was brilliant, and children do all sorts of things, and the parents do all sorts of other things. Even though, in general, I say in general, people follow their parents, but sometimes it doesn't happen because other things interfere. And this is when it comes to religion, we know that, there are more than 1 billion Muslims in the world. It's not because people convert to Islam and they think that Islam is the true religion. It's because Muslim women have many children. That's all. And the same thing is true for Catholic people. Okay.
And for Orthodox Jews?
Orthodox Jews, whatever. Yeah. It's usually, you're born into a certain family and you follow the identity. But there are cases where people do other things and leave behind the identity of their parents. This also happens.
Okay.
So,
Benny,
okay.
one more time. It was my pleasure speaking to you, and you will hear from me again.
Okay. Will I get a copy of the...
That's what I mean. You definitely will hear from me again. You get everything.
Very good. Okay. Thanks
Okay.
very much. I enjoyed it. Oh,
It
and
was my pleasure.
You know what this is?
You have to hold it up. We can't see it. Higher, higher, higher. People sitting around. I can't see who it is.
Okay. Who's at the head of the table?
I can't see the face.
Okay.
No, it's not sharp enough. I can't see it.
Okay. Yasser Arafat.
Ah, and the rest?
And I'm here. And this is Uri Avneri. This is in 1995.
Okay.
I visited Yasser
Yeah.
Arafat in Gaza.
Yeah. What last question, I promise. What do you think about, or what did you think about Arafat? And did it change between then and now? What you thought about him or think about him?
No, I think he made a big mistake by agreeing to the Oslo Accords.
Mhm.
That's the thing. But other than that, he was the leader who created, really the Palestinian movement. And he made a big difference in this world. But he, I think, made a mistake when he agreed to the Oslo Accords, which were really bad for the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think there's universal agreement. It was almost a trap.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Benny, again, thank you so much.
Okay.
I wish you all the best.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for tuning into SaltCube Analytics. We hope today's episode gave you something to think about and challenged the way you see the world. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe or follow us and leave a review or a comment. Your feedback helps us keep questioning the status quo. For more insights and discussions, follow us on YouTube, Rumble, TikTok, Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any of your other preferred podcast platforms. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, always look beyond the headlines.